Hopkins from the Fair Museum Jobs team, and I'm also a curator of aircraft at the Royal Air Force Museum. Before we start anything, I just want to begin by talking about terminologies and what we mean by the term CV, as we're anticipating having some participants from the US and Canada, where the term CV and resume can have two distinct meanings. I'm not an expert on this. I've only ever worked in the UK, but my understanding is that a CV in North American English is a big master document which contains pretty much everything that you've done, whereas a resume is something shorter and more tailored, and that's the thing that you would submit to potential employees as part of the recruitment process. So for anybody from the US or Canada or anywhere else that uses American English, we'll be using the term CV here, but you'll understand it as resume. But just wanted to clarify that first of all. So before anything else, I'd like to introduce our panel. I'm going to start in a clockwise fashion. So Lowri, please.
Oh, that's confusing because I'm not clockwise for me. Hi, I'm Lowri Jones. I'm the Senior Curator at the Royal College of Physicians Museum in London.
And Julie?
Hi there, I'm Julie Bond. I'm Head of Collections Care at the National Library of Scotland, based in Edinburgh.
And Georgina?
Hi everyone, I'm Georgina. I'm Digital Media Content Manager at National Museums of Scotland.
So I'm going to start off with what I hope is a fairly easy question. That is, what should be on a CV? Who would like to start us off?
I'll kick off if you want. I recruit as part of my job, so it's a big part of my job, filling the team, filling vacancies, looking for the right people. So I think in terms of a CV, if you are asked to submit one as part of a recruitment process, I think that's one way that you should tailor your CV. You may then also send a CV in on Spec if you are job hunting. So I think there are two distinct types of CV. So if you're asked to submit one as part of a recruitment process, I would say it should be as comprehensive as possible, but without being overlong. And it should also be tailored to the job that you're applying for. So that might mean giving greater emphasis to various bits of your experience that you feel are relevant to the job that you're applying for. Whereas the one that you're sending in on Spec, I suggest you go as short as possible and as kind of snappy as you can, because my experience is if it's too long, it just won't get read at all, full stop. So those are the two kind of different types of CV that I would suggest people should be considering. I'd also say there's key information that you should include, obviously, that are name and contact details and your qualifications and the education provider, and make sure you have dates attached to that. People do look kind of forensically at CVs and try and work out if there are career gaps and what might have been going on. So it's really, really important that you have dates on there. I would say relevant work experience, and that could be paid or unpaid. And also something that people forget, I think, is if you've managed to do some training and you actually got some funding to do that training, you got a bursary or a grant or something, chuck that in as well, because that shows, you know, a certain aspect of how keen you are and how dedicated you are to your career. And also membership of professional bodies, I'd include that as well on your CV. So there's loads of things, but one thing I would like to say, and I'll probably say this again in this session, is please double check your spelling, because from my point of view, there is absolutely nothing worse than a CV that contains spelling mistakes. It'll just go to the bottom of the pile as far as I'm concerned. So that's a big no-no for me.
Anybody else have anything to add to that?
I guess the only thing I'd added that I would expect to see at least a small section sort of highlighting key skills, even if it's not in much detail. So yeah, educate, qualifications, experience, and the sort of skills that are most relevant.
And that would be sort of disaggregated from the list of jobs.
Yeah, pulled out specifically.
Okay. I might add to that also publications if you've got them. And I think that can be things as small as blog posts. Just shows that you've done something else. And I would say for voluntary work as well, think bigger about what voluntary work might be. Prior to the session, I was having a look at my CV, and all of the voluntary work I had listed was traditional museum voluntary roles like collections, volunteer, things like that. But then I realised actually what I'm doing now is voluntary work, and the whole Fair Museum Jobs project is voluntary work as well. So do think of the bigger picture. Is there anything else that should go onto a CV?
I don't think so. From my point of view, I thought that was pretty comprehensive. I guess I'd think about the application process in the round. So, if you're every time I've done a museum job application, it has, a CV might have been part of an application, but I've also needed to submit a cover letter and explain sort of how I meet the criteria on the job description. So for me, the CV's always, for museum jobs at least, had a bit of a kind of secondary role that really just outlines very clearly my kind of employment history and the skills that I picked up along the way, as well as my kind of contact details and education. So yeah, I guess it depends slightly what kind of application you're going for. But in general, most of the kind of museum jobs I've seen posted are a kind of more full application alongside a CV, if a CV is even asked for.
Yeah, I think we've seen a growth of sort of application portals lately, but I don't think that's universal across the board, which is why I still think it's useful to have a CV in the bank. Just to pull out and to update regularly as well for when you've done new things and you've learned new things as well. Talking about layout, how would we discussed what should go onto a CV, but how would you structure that information? What order would you put things in, for instance? And is there even a right or a wrong answer to that? Lowri.
I'd say I don't think there's necessarily a right order as long as it's really clear. Like the worst thing is if you've got like hundreds of applications and then you've got something where you have to dig to get the information out. Like you want it to be presented clearly and you just want to be able to be like, okay, cool, yeah, they've got the qualifications, that's the job they're referring to in their statement. Like, yeah, that's all cool. Like, and as long as you don't have to sift through it to pull out what's relevant, then yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd second that. I mean, it's different, I imagine, if you're applying for, an illustration role or something that you're trying to sell your design background. But my background is kind of digital roles, and in that, it's about kind of clarity and the experience you've picked up and the places that you've worked before. I'm happy to drop my CV into the chat. Just it might be a bit easier than me sort of describing what it looks like. It's by no means like a perfect CV or whatever. I mean, it's worked quite well for me, but if it's helpful at all, I'll just drop that in, and so you have view-only access to that.
Thanks for that, Georgina. I think when I was first compiling a CV, I was told of a certain structure that it should follow, which is to have education first, then work experience, then membership of professional bodies. But I think as I've grown as a professional, I've actually turned that on its head, and I put my professional experience first because I do feel it's more relevant. My degrees in classics, for instance, and yeah, I work with aircraft, and the Greeks and Romans famously didn't have much luck with trying to fly. So I just feel it's more relevant for me. But equally, I think there's no right or wrong answers with that.
I think that's a really good point, actually, particularly with the qualifications and all the discussion at the moment about, are, say, postgrad qualifications necessary? And if we do keep putting the qualifications at the top, I feel like that is reinforcing it a bit. A lot of this is just making me rethink my own CV, but there's no set structure, but that's I really like that point about moving things around to highlight whatever you feel is the most important element.
I would agree with that. My CV, which again is by no means perfect, to be honest, the only reason I use it these days is for when I'm submitting conference abstracts. The only reason I've used my CV in probably the last 5 years. I've got personal profile at the top, which explains what I do now, the role I have and the responsibilities. And then I think from that, it flows quite nicely to have your previous experience rather than your education. So yeah, I would agree that that's probably slipping down the page in a way. I mean, also, I guess I've seen a lot recently. We have internship positions at the library, and we do request a CV for that. It's not an application heavy process, and we get CVs. And I've seen some brilliant ones, I've got to say, and ones with photos, and that's a controversial issue as to whether or not you include a photo or not. But in terms of layout, there's some really exciting templates that you can use, or you can just go completely to town. I think I would say ones that stick out in my mind have been quite colourful in their layout, but quite restrained, colour that's used well rather than like crazy mad. But I think that is effective.
That's touched on 2 points that I want to talk about. The first is attaching photographs to CVs. And I think that's very, very problematic. A lot of the direction recruitment is moving in these days is to sort of blind the process a bit more against individual prejudices, especially around things like race or gender, which would be clearly identifiable from a photograph. So I would always caution against attaching a photograph to a CV or an application. I think it feeds into structures that have known problems, and it maybe shows a lack of awareness as well if you do that. So maybe people have other views, but I think that's something to avoid. The other thing as well, my CV is very boring. It's very black and white. It's just a list, and I know I've seen other formats that are a bit more creative. I take your point about having a bit of colour but not going overboard, but I'm wondering if Lowri or Georgina have any views about breaking the mould of the traditional CV into something more lively.
Tend to be on your side of the fence, Tom. As simple as possible, and I hate photos for the reasons you said. I feel like it just, particularly if you're working within a system where I know some HR systems sort of strip out the personal information to try and make the recruitment process more blind, but a lot of them don't. So I've never recruited with a blind process. So, some people aren't necessarily going to have this in mind, but if you're trying to read things and be neutral, which is, quite difficult in itself, and you then have people throwing photos at you, I'm just like, no, you're just making it worse. Please don't do that. So no photos. In terms of the colour, I guess I've seen some where it worked effectively, but it would, I suppose, just be careful, because maybe that if you're sort of going that, the temptation is then to sort of get over elaborate and sort of detract from it a bit. But I mean, personally, I would stick to the just simple, probably black and white, but then you're getting into the personal preferences of whoever's doing the recruiting, and you're never going to be able to balance up for everything that that might entail. So I'm not sure that's a helpful answer.
Sorry, Georgina.
I was just going to say, I'd agree on the pictures. I've never put a picture on my CV, but I have, reviewed CVs, and it is quite jarring, disorientating when you see a sort of photo of someone on their CV. I think some colour, like I put a bit of colour just on the headings of my CV, just so that it kind of breaks it up a bit. But equally, when I've been reviewing CVs, sometimes HR have printed off, 200 CVs or however many people we've got going for the role, and that's often black and white, photocopied, etc. So you know, you can lose a lot of the kind of granularity of colour if that's a sort of important part of how your CV gets seen.
I think there's an important accessibility thing with colours as well, and that whatever you do should remain as accessible as possible. That's just good practice, right, in everything that we do. But especially, I think in our sector, accessibility should be at the core of daily practice, and that should include the recruitment process as well. And mainly that onus is on recruiters, but I think it also does fall upon candidates as well, to an extent, to make their applications accessible. We are getting some really good questions coming in through the chat, and we will address these in a moment. But I've just got a few more things to discuss, and I think this is one that a lot of people ask, and again, one that to an extent there's no right or wrong answer, but it is, how long should a CV be? And does anybody have anything to add that's a bit more fuller than it depends?
I've always stuck to something that you could have on one sheet, so 2 sides of A4. I don't know where I got that from, but it just seems unwieldy if it's longer than that. And I know, like, when you're reading them, you don't really want to have to look through more than probably that, if you've got loads to sift through again. And I guess from like a personal point of view, I always take my CV into job interviews and stuff. So obviously you don't want to be shuffling around millions of sheets of paper, and if you can have it double-sided, that's quite handy. So that would be my answer, but like I said, that's kind of a personal, practical thing.
Yeah, I've tried to keep mine to one side, which has got increasingly difficult as kind of move roles and gain more experience. But I mean, actually, my my experience is sort of half private sector digital things, half museums, and I've used the CV a lot more in private sector stuff. Where and then I think, when you're dealing with kind of recruitment agents and things, they do want things as kind of tight and succinct as possible. Yeah, one side I think is about as much attention they're going to give to however many people they're going through that day. So yeah, as short. But I think that's partly the field I'm in, digital. I imagine it's different for curatorial roles.
Yeah, I would agree that probably realistically 2 sides of A4 is about as far as I'll read. But yeah, I did wonder whether curatorial positions would expect to include more in terms of, if you're looking for publications and various different things. I mean, I think it's always problematic when there's huge long lists of things, because you're just not going to read it, and especially if it's then replicated or duplicated rather in the recruitment portal and the information you've already put in that way. Yeah, I think it can get quite difficult if it gets too long.
I think that's very interesting about curatorial roles maybe needing longer CVs. I don't think that I've found that in my experience, but that may be true in maybe more conservative institutions which have a more academic leaning, like university museums, for instance. Lowri, you're in a curatorial position. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I would say I'm very much on the collections rather than the academic side of curatorial, so I'm not really sure. I guess to sort of sidestep your question and talk about something else. Obviously, with a lot of museums jobs, I'm not sure, this maybe varies with the different focuses, but a lot of people are likely to have a lot of different roles, so it might be that you literally can't fill your jobs on one page.
So I found my CV drifting into the 3-page length, which the consensus is that's probably a bit too long. So if you were looking to cut length, what would you go to first to cut out?
I guess it depends what you're applying for. Like, I think it's quite easy for CVs to grow and grow if you just sort of continue adding to them. But if you're kind of like, okay, in this point of my career, I'm interested in XYZ job, then certain skills or certain bits of your experience will kind of come into relief relative to others. So I'd probably, just go to a blank sheet and then be like, okay, what's the most important bits here? And then you can kind of copy and paste the bits that are pertinent from your long list. But that might be easier than trying to gently prune away from what you've got potentially.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think if there's some way of summarizing, especially around skills, you know, how we were mentioning earlier about key skills, you might have huge long list of training courses that you've been on, and you might be an expert in your field in one area. But if you can come and summarize it under your key skills, that sort of says, you know, training courses connected to X, Y, and Z, rather than listing each individual one, you might be able to kind of pull things together a bit more.
Yeah, and I think I was thinking about this recently, trying to trim mine down. If you've got like old jobs which aren't relevant, so like like my first job was like in a chip shop, and then I was an admin assistant, like they're not relevant at all. If you need them because they want to see that you've been employed for like the last 10 years or whatever, then you can just put the title, the place, and the date. Like, you don't have to put any information. I think like my bottom paragraph is just bullet points of my old job titles that aren't like relevant anymore. So even if you need to list stuff, you don't necessarily have to go into detail if it's not relevant.
That's something I've been toying with. I worked for the supermarket Morrison's for a long time before I got into museums. And although I absolutely champion retail or any industry as somewhere to develop transferable skills, I'm just not sure if that's what employers are looking for necessarily. So I've toyed with the idea of cutting that out. I've also, I think GCSEs and A levels now that I've got a master's degree and I've got now 8 years of professional experience. If they're not asked for on the personal spec, I'm not sure if they have that place on a CV. I'm not saying it's wrong to include them, but I think that's somewhere where you can look to cut without it having a serious impact. I had a question about leaving out part-time jobs as well. And this is also something that I've been toying with. Like many people in museums, I've had a lot of short-term and part-time contracts, and some of them have been relevant to museums, but occasionally I felt that they were at odds with my career trajectory, and in some cases were a bit of a step down. Would you advocate cutting them out, even if it gives an incomplete picture, but at the benefit of saving up lots of space?
I guess the only trouble might be places can sometimes get funny if there's unexplained gaps. So if there was a way of like indicating that you had, been gainfully employed, whatever, during that period, then do that, but without going into the detail. I guess it sort of depends how much information you're wrangling with.
In this particular case, it was when I had 2 concurrent part-time jobs, so it can be made to look like there's not that gap there.
Yeah, if I was you, I'd just pick and choose in that case.
Yeah. Well, so gaps, I think it's fine to have career gaps, absolutely, but it's a tricky one because some people are gonna, if they see a gap, some people will want to know why, even though it's not really any of their business. And I think it's really a really tricky one about balancing what information you feel comfortable giving out versus prejudices you're going to face from a potential screener.
Yeah, I guess normally in a museum you'll also have the cover letter, I think. So if it's a bit confusing on my CV why I've moved from somewhere to another, I sometimes, or moved quite a lot, I'll sometimes do a bit more of that kind of explanation in the cover letter, to explain that my partner had moved the length of the country, or that was actually, or a certain job was a fixed term role, so I had to move on. so I don't tend to put that level of detail or like why I left in the CV, but if it's relevant to like my next move, then I would put it in the cover letter.
We've had a question about unemployment periods as well, and I think this is particularly relevant now with the fallout of COVID-19. I've not been in that position before, but if I was, I think I would I put it down, and I hope that employers would be sympathetic to that and understand why. Do the panel have any thoughts on that?
I guess again it goes back to, you know, why are you writing the CV? Are you doing this on spec, or are you doing it as part of a recruitment process? I do think you have to be upfront and honest in a recruitment process. So I do think you have to disclose that sort of information, and I think there's always a way of turning that to your advantage as well, in terms of the kind of CPD that maybe you were focusing on in that period. So you can kind of craft it in a way that makes it positive. I think, as you say, this is something that a lot of people in the sector are facing, will be facing. So I do think we all have to kind of lean into that and be honest about it, because otherwise it will cause people to kind of start thinking, well, what are they hiding here? What's going on here? So I would be honest about it.
So we've had a question about what CV on spec means. So that's a sort of the word's escaping me now. A speculative application when you write to organisations, in the off chance that they may have some opportunities or would be able to put your details on file if anything comes up. Do you think speculative applications are worthwhile, Julie?
I get them from freelancers, mostly looking for, you know, work rather than jobs. I get them from students and emerging conservators looking for placements and volunteer opportunities. So those are the times I receive them. And as part of that process, I do find it really helpful. If I was looking to follow up on a placement opportunity, it's the sort of information I would want as part of that. So to share it up front is very, very helpful. So yeah, I think they are useful from that point of view.
It's something I've never assumed would actually work. So it's really, really interesting to hear that view. Yeah, I don't know if Lowri or Georgina have any experience with this.
Not in museums, and it's the sort of thing that you know, I can imagine doing with kind of agencies, sort of putting things in and seeing if people were interested, either over email or on something like LinkedIn. But I wouldn't know how to do that. I wouldn't have thought of doing that within museums for permanent roles.
Yeah, I've never received any, and I always thought it seemed like quite an old-fashioned way of going about things. I think what Julie said about freelancers and like placements and maybe like voluntary work, that makes a lot of sense actually, but for regular jobs I would personally find that a bit weird.
We got a question about whether work history on a CV should be divided up between paid and voluntary.
Can I answer this? I was thinking about this recently. So actually before this session I was looking at my CV, and on mine I do have them separate, but I was like, actually why? I don't think there's any reason they should be separate. It's all valid experience, and if we are separating them out, if all of us are separating it out, we're perpetuating that sort of false, you know, thing, whatever you want to call it, of voluntary work being lesser, which we know is not true. So yeah, totally put them together. It's valid experience. Just because you weren't being paid for it doesn't mean it's any less good experience.
I would echo that entirely. Yeah, it's such a good place to build experience. and you can get as much experience as you can from volunteering as you can from a paid role. I just think be really clear and honest though about what counts as voluntary role and what counts as a paid role, because they do come with different responsibilities, and I think that can sometimes have an impact.
I love seeing, you know, people's commitment through the voluntary work that they do. I'm always absolutely gobsmacked by, you know, how much volunteering people are able or become able to do. You know, it's just it's incredible. And this sector is, you know, it does touch on something. This sector almost expects it. It's built on the backs of that, and that's a shame. That's the position that we're in, but everyone's done it, so yeah, it should definitely be on there. It's very, very valid experience.
And we've had a question about how do you indicate you've changed roles within the same organisation, and why. I think my approach to that would be to just list it as 2 different entries, and maybe have a short explanation, but not entirely necessary. How would any of you manage that? And have either of you changed roles within the same organisation? I think, Lowri, you
I have quite a lot, but in 2 different organisations. Yeah, I've always just listed them as separate jobs. On my CV, I haven't put why I've changed, because application forms quite often ask that anyway. I'm not sure if that's expected on a CV. I wouldn't necessarily have thought so, unless it's, I guess maybe if it's something odd, like you spent like a month in one role or something. But if it's just, you know, you were there for a bit, you changed jobs, as far as I'm concerned, that's just a different job.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. So I've never been in the position of sort of you know, staying in a job and then being like promoted within the same organization. I guess if that was the case, then I'd definitely list them as 2 different jobs and the different responsibilities and experience I gained in those 2 different roles. I've been in the position where my job title has changed, but like my salary and like the level of responsibility I've got has increased, but my salary band has not increased. And as I've kind of had to relook at my CV and kind of shorten it, I've just kind of rolled those 2 positions together, as they were for the same organization, and explained the extra experience I got in the kind of expanded version of the role, but I didn't list out the 2 different job titles, because they were, I think one was like project lead and one was sort of project manager or something. You know, there wasn't much in it. It was supposed to look like I'd had a kind of pay increase, but I hadn't, and so it kind of became by the by.
I started off the session by talking about the difference between CVs and resumes, and how in North American English, a CV can mean a big master document where you keep everything. Do you think there's benefits in keeping a master CV where you put absolutely everything and keep it as a running document?
I have 2 different versions of this. So I have one enormous document which is more linked to like writing statements for application forms, where I have examples of like, you know, what I've written before for teamwork, what I've written before for collections management, blah blah blah, like a massive document of that, so that I don't have to rewrite everything each time. And then I also have 2 versions of my CV. One of them is like the neat version that I'd give to people, and the other one is the same but just with more detail about my roles, so that I can, you know, tailor it a bit more, like Julia was talking about earlier. And I think that's probably like 4 pages or something. And I also find that really helpful for when I'm filling in application forms as well, because I keep, you know, like my job titles and all the dates and the addresses of my employers on there as well. So yeah, more like as a information for me rather than for any other reason. But yeah, I find that really helpful.
We had a question about how to what dates to put on a CV as well, about whether it should just be years, months, and years, or years, months, and days. What are your thoughts?
I've months, but I guess it depends, you know, how many years you've spent in roles, really.
Yeah, I think if you're running through a number of short-term contracts. You can say 6-month contract, and so you don't need to have the actual day you started and the day you finished. You can kind of just summarize that. I think it's probably neater maybe to do it that way. I don't know.
That's a good point. Yeah, I always do months and years because of short-term stuff, but actually that's quite a nice way of doing it if you're just saying this job 6 months, this job, whatever.
And that's what LinkedIn I think does by default, and I think it is quite readable, and to have the number of months that you've been in that post. Not something I've done on my CV, but I've been moving away from including specific dates, because I think with the amount of CVs a recruiter could be receiving, they're just not going to be interested with that level of detail. Although it's always useful to write them down somewhere else. I had a question about including links to previous work or additional information for the recruiter to access.
Guess you could.
I think it's fine. I mean, if they're not interested, they don't have to click it. If they are interested, they can. And it's better to send a link which is concise than to send it all as an attachment.
Yeah, I guess it depends on how they're accessing them, because I know when I've sifted, I've done it on the computer, but I think Julie, one of you said about having them printed off, and obviously you're not going to be able to use links if they're all in paper format. But yeah.
I've got much more kind of detail on my LinkedIn account too, including kind of things I've published, and sort of LinkedIn's got a feature a bit like Medium where you can kind of post articles and things there. So I guess, and going back to one of the previous questions, LinkedIn would be where I had my kind of full version of my CV and my links, and my CV would be a really kind of high level summary and the links to where they can find me in more detail, like Twitter and LinkedIn.
And we've had questions about having a separate key skills field. What do you think the benefits are for that? And to what extent would you tailor that as well against a personal specification?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean that's it. You know, if you're recruiting and you've got a person spec and a job description, it's all there. It's all in those documents. That is what you will recruit from, and you have to match against those specific requirements. So absolutely, if you're going to put in key skills, make sure they match what's being asked for. And it's a really nice way of pulling it out from all the other stuff. You know, it makes it very, very clear, and you can pick out that information really easily.
Yeah, and I think even if it's a CV that's accompanying like an application form or a statement or something where you've already pulled out these skills, if you then have them listed at whatever section on your CV, and it's clear that these are your key skills, even if you don't actually consider them to be your main ones, like if you're saying you are, it just makes it that much more obvious that you meet the points on the spec.
The chances are that it will be read by the person who wrote the personal spec, and they would have put their favourite buzzwords in mind, and parroting those buzzwords back to them is always good, just because it's going to catch their eye and they're going to think, oh yeah, this person thinks like me. So I think it's always a good thing to do. We've had a question about what would you consider as key skills in the museum field, and I would say actually it's not really for us to. I'm sure we've all got our own ideas, but it's not really up for us to say what they are, because what's really important for you is what does the recruiter consider the key skills for that post, and they may be wrong, but they, as Julie said, they will have put all of that information, all of those selection criteria down in the job description and the personal specification. And I'm just going to plug the session that we're having later on in the week on writing covering letters, which is on Friday at 10:30 to 11:30 a.m. So that will deal more with about how to dissect personal specifications and job descriptions. So
this is just your Fair Museum Jobs Zoom gremlin. I've put links in the chat to some of the sessions relevant to what we've been talking about as well, including LinkedIn, covering letters, and I'm just about to post the job descriptions.
Thank you very much, Zoom gremlin. So please do look at those links. I had a question about curators having a portfolio to visually showcase as opposed to just listing all exhibitions. I think for me, and I'm guessing for Lowri too, we don't have much exhibition design workload. It's more about the collections side.
Yeah, collections and content rather than the visuals.
I don't know if Georgina or Julie have experience in anything with a more visual element, and would you have a portfolio for that?
I haven't needed it in my roles.
Yeah, we in the conservation world, it's quite common that you'll build up a portfolio of examples of your work. Obviously, it's very visual. It does help to explain a treatment and decision making. You can't bring the object along with you, so portfolio is great. We do use them. They're very common and they're very useful. And I've seen some great examples of them, but a huge amount of work can go into creating those. But again, something to be working on in the background, keep it up to date, have that information to hand so that you're not reinventing the wheel every time.
I guess that reminded me of, it's not quite the same thing, but when I was recruiting for an events role last, what really impressed me was it wasn't, rather than like a digital thing, so it wasn't something sent with the application, but someone brought in they'd collected loads of leaflets for the projects and the events and things they'd worked on in the past and just sort of spewed them all over the table. So, and that made a really strong and really good impression actually, because it was, a huge variety of stuff, and it showed that they'd been actively sort of engaging in what they did and sort of thinking about what they were doing for the future going along. So if you are creating a portfolio, it doesn't necessarily have to just be a Swish website or a Swish, whatever format on the computer. There's other ways you can do it as well.
We've had a question about whether when you're sort of talking more detail about your experience, whether you should put that through full sentences or use bullet points. I favour bullet points.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, think. I guess one thing we haven't really mentioned in terms of, think of what it looks like on the page. If you are trying to squeeze it all in, but it's very, very dense in terms of text, that'll put people off reading it. So yeah, I would always go for bullet points.
I think if you find it's getting a bit too long as well, don't try and cheat it by having super narrow margins and really small text, because you're just going to defeat the purpose of it. And consider that whoever is looking at these applications is going to be looking at potentially hundreds, if not thousands, with the economic uncertainty heading into the future. So being concise is going to be your friend here, I think. Had a question about references. I know I have in the past seen references on a CV. I don't personally think they really belong there. And I can see Julie and Georgina nodding. So typically you'll be asked for references only after you've been offered the job. And we've had a question as well about whether those referees need to be from a relevant industry. And again, I would say no. I don't think there's that much benefit, and especially if you're starting out, it's fine to use a friend of the family or somebody that you've worked for in retail. I don't know if anybody's got any other views on that.
I've often with museums actually had to give references in advance, and so then I do tend to pick them a bit based on the job that I'm going for. you know, who I think would be a good fit, or, you know, the current the employer that I'm going for would like to hear from. But yeah, obviously for my first role, it was just I think it was like a lecturer and someone that I'd worked with as a, like, you know, in retail. But yeah, since then, when I had work experience, I sort of tried to tailor it to the type of museum that I'm going for, and match them there. But I think also a potential disadvantage of putting referees on the CV is it's good to let your referees know in advance that you've done that. So if you're just sending off millions of off-spec applications, they won't necessarily know.
I've seen the letters GDPR come up in the chat, so yeah, that is relevant. So do definitely ask your referees first before putting them down. Also putting references available on request as well. I mean, you can do that, but I think it's a given. So I think that's a line that you can save from your CV and put something that's potentially more useful there.
Someone said they often get asked specifically for a CV with references, in which case put the references on.
Yeah,
like if they've asked for that, then do it.
if they ask you for something specifically, then yeah, do provide them with what they ask. I have a question about tips for CVs for career changes. The one that springs to mind for me is if you should avoid using industry specific language if you're going from one industry to the other. I don't know if anybody's got anything else to add to that.
I guess maybe focus, depending on how much detail you're going in space-wise and that, but focus on the transferable skills, like that are, because there's going to be elements that are relevant. It just might be that, you know, rather than like I did this, you just say, you know, highlight what bits are relevant to the job you're applying for, less than, you know, just a summary of a museum job would be. So maybe assume that the person reading it has absolutely no idea what that meant, and therefore if you don't tell them why it's relevant, they will just be like, that's not relevant.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. I'd probably lead a bit at the top and say why on a kind of professional level you think this makes sense. You know, at this point of my career, I want to do X, Y, and Z for ABC reasons. If it is a professional reason that you're changing career paths, just because that wouldn't necessarily be clear from like your employment history why you are making this move. So I'd probably do that.
A question about whether you should evidence key skills that you put on your CV.
Well, I guess I've kind of put the roles I've had and what I learned in them, so yes.
On mine, which again I'm not sure if this is a particularly good format, but I've got sort of a bullet point of key skills, and it'll say like the skill and then just sort of a couple of brief phrases evidencing it. So like collections management, all aspects of collections management during this role, blah blah blah. I don't, although I'm not, yeah, like I said, I'm not sure if that's necessarily the best way, but I'd probably want to see some evidence of it, because otherwise you've literally just got someone saying teamwork, motivation, like curatorial skills, and you're like, okay, you're just repeating the spec back at me.
I wonder if the evidence is better placed in the personal statement or covering letter, though, because I know we've been suggesting that CVs should be two sides. I personally don't think that advice carries over to covering letters. I think they should be obviously not incredibly long, but it's all about the spec. You've got to go through that spec and show you meet everything with an evidenced example. Whereas I think the CV is much more at a glance kind of thing.
Yeah, I agree. My CV tends to stay a lot more static, and then I have all of the job applications that I've done before, so it's now quite quick if I want to write another job application to kind of copy and paste the fairly standard criteria they ask for from previous applications. So and my covering letter application that meets the specification is always much longer and much more tailored than my CV But that may be particular to digital roles rather than curatorial ones.
I would say you can always tailor, but it's completely fine to copy and paste within that overall effort, because the same things will come up again and again. Is it okay to group jobs together? For instance, if you've had a lot of temporary or part-time roles over a period of time?
I don't see why not if you're saying the same things about them. Like if it's sort of similar responsibilities, or if it's maybe jobs that aren't necessarily that relevant to what you're applying for and you're trying to save space. I don't see why that would be bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's...
I would agree with that. Sorry, I would say, if you can summarize, several project jobs covering X, Y, and Z, I think that would be fine. And I think that's kind of, we all work in this sector, so we all expect to see that at the start of a career, a lot of project jobs. So a creative way of pulling them together, pulling out the main skills and the main themes from them would be really, really good, I think.
That's something I've been considering, because I've got about 5 voluntary roles over a 2-year period at the beginning of my career, and I'm not sure if I need to list them individually anymore. Should you include personal interests or hobbies on a CV at all?
I think I might have done on my first CV when I didn't have all that much to talk about, but or maybe I've sort of flipped about a bit between sort of startups and agencies and museums, so maybe for a startup I might, but not for museums. I probably wouldn't.
I don't. Sorry, Lowri.
I was going to say, it's not relevant to your ability to do the job, and it's like pictures. It's just going to make the person think one way or another about you, and I don't think that really has a place.
Yeah, I would echo that. I don't think it adds a lot particularly. I have been asked about hobbies interview at all. In one instance in the past, which was, do I have any hobbies through which I could demonstrate good manual dexterity? It was for an archives assistant job, I think, where you'd be handling lots of paper documents.
Actually, I think I've used Hobbies to evidence stuff like that on job applications before, but
I think that's fine, and you can evidence a skill from wherever you've got it, but I wouldn't list.
They do sometimes ask it on application forms, which is a bit weird, and obviously if they've specifically asked, you can't have to answer, but I think it's a bit unnecessary to offer it.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, if say your hobby is really relevant to your job, then do put it on. If you were going for a curatorial role working with musical instruments and you played one in which they had a particular strong representation, then that probably is relevant. Yes, and I'm sure there are other examples. Do you need to address every single point of a JD personal specification in the cover letter? We'll deal with that more at the covering letter session. The answer is yes. And time's coming, starting to run out, so only a few more, I think. So if you've been working in the same role or department for a long period of time, how would you outline your tasks and achievements during that time? Would you do it chronologically? Would you make it project-based? Would you break it down into different skills? Thinking if you've been for 10 or 20 years in the same role, that could potentially be a massive block of text on a CV.
I think I'd be selective about key projects that I'd worked on or key achievements really from that period of time. I was in the same job for 12 years, and there are sort of 5 key things that I repeat every time about that job, because they're the bits I'm most proud of and the bits that show my skills best. So I'd probably take that approach.
Thank you. I can squeeze in. So just to recap, really, could you briefly explain how a CV should look from the top of the page down and which order to put things in? So we did sort of discuss this at the beginning of the session. So I'm gonna say what I do, which is paid professional experience, voluntary experience, education, and membership of professional bodies. And I'm sure I've left something out, but I can't remember what. But Lowri, what order? Contact details are right at the top.
Yeah,
right at the top. And my name as well. Lowri, how about yours?
Mine is contact details, and actually I think after this session I'm going to change this, but at the moment it's education, so which I'll probably move down, paid experience, then voluntary experience, which I'll probably amalgamate, and then professional memberships, which I might move up actually.
Julie?
Mine's name and contact details, personal profile, quite brief, and then it's work experience, and then qualifications, and then membership.
And Georgina?
So at the moment, mine's name, contact details, my current role. In previous versions of my CV, I've had a sort of current past education structure, but then also a future structure, like what I'm looking for next, and that's been very tailored for each job that you know, when I've had that section about that future section about what I'm looking for next, that's been very tailored to each job. But then my current role and then previous roles, which and I think I've sort of made more prominent my last 3 roles, which were all in museums, and then given slightly less coverage to the ones that were in the private sector previously, and then education right at the bottom. But that's partly because in digital, you know, my degree is really not relevant at all, and you know, there'd be people that could do the jobs in my department without a degree very well, and it'd be good to have more of them in the sector.
Yeah, brilliant. We are out of time, so I'm afraid we're going to have to end things there. I'd just like to say thank you to everyone for attending. I hope you found it a useful session, and thank you as well to our brilliant panel, Lowri, Julie and Georgina. It's been a pleasure.